We spend a lot of our lives in preparation. We're always preparing for something, it seems. Just in our normal routine of life, we're preparing for the day, preparing breakfast, preparing to go to school or to go to work. And even in retirement, there are things to prepare for. Volunteer work, or those chores around the house, or the projects you're working on, or trips to the store. I spend a lot of time preparing a sermon. I start preparing on Tuesday until I get here on Sunday and preach. And I will tell you that my preparations were disrupted on Friday when I read a news article and I began thinking, I need to talk about something a little different than what I was going to speak about originally. I read a news report where Dr. Francis Collins, the director of the National Institutes of Health, is recommending that churches stay closed for the time being because of the rising numbers of COVID cases, hospitalizations, and deaths. I think the word closed is an unfortunate word, and I don't really think that's what he meant, because he's not talking about churches closing down entirely. What he's talking about is gathering for public worship. Dr. Collins is himself a devout Christian who speaks very openly about his faith and who has written about it and has spent time looking at how to combine both his faith and his scientific knowledge. So he knows of what he speaks when he knows how a church works. I think we've done a good job at St. Simon Peter staying open with the live stream service and many other things that are done online. And we've done a good job with what we've done here for Sunday morning. However, as this virus continues to rage among us, we now are having the equivalent deaths of a 9/11 every day. We may have actually exceeded that by now. And that's something for us to be concerned about. And so it was with great difficulty, after consulting with the vestry and going back and forth and really spending a big chunk of my day on Friday, that I'd made the decision that we need to, for the time being, suspend our Sunday morning gatherings like this and just have the bare bones of the people who put on the live stream service, which will continue. That's why I decided, too, that today we will not celebrate communion. I will not distribute communion today. I sent an email out. I hope you got that. Those of you who registered, if you did not, I'm sorry that you're coming and learning now. It's really about the social distancing. Quite frankly, I have lost sleep over the prospect of something happening at the church in terms of somehow passing along COVID-19 or someone else passing it along and getting it myself. I think it's time to be cautious. And those preparations that we've made are changed yet again. I thought back to my sermon on August 2nd. I didn't have this in mind. I had to track it down to find the right day, where I spoke about how in life we have a time in which we are oriented, and then something comes along and we're disoriented and we have to reorient. Well, that's where we are again now. We're at a time of reorientation as we figure out how to continue our celebration of Advent and have our celebration of Christmas. I think we've done a good job of reorienting. It's not something that I wanted to do in my last few weeks with you. My time with you is about to wrap up. And I was perfectly content and happy to rock along like we're doing, because we've spent a lot of time, those of us who work on worship, thinking, how do we do this in a meaningful way that is safe? And so here we are again, reorienting right at the end of my time with you. A lot of people spend a lot of time preparing things for this church and doing things, and have had themselves had to reorient. Justin, months ago, began planning lessons and carols. He knows what an important service that is for this community, not just this church community, but for Pell City. So there's been this kind of constant reorientation for him and the choir. And they have put together what I'm looking forward to, which is going to be a beautiful Lessons in Carol service. I believe they wrapped up the recordings yesterday. I came very briefly to do my part in that late in the afternoon. And there's that continual thinking, how do we be the church in this time of a pandemic? Something none of us have had to face. It's just a matter of being faithful and being the church as best we can. Thinking too about Melinda Nepper and her work with Friendship Place. That barely got off the ground before Melinda was having to think about how does she carry out that ministry for people with memory loss and for their caregivers. And she's been creative in doing that and continuing. And that's also the church being open and being the church. And I know from talking to Melinda that she's already thinking about, as we look and are really looking at months of still being limited in what we can do, that Melinda is taking seriously how to carry out that ministry, even beyond what she's doing now. And then there's Zoom coffee hour, another way to try to stay open. It's not trying to stay open, it's staying open and having that community. And I encourage you to participate in that. Ellen Mayer does a wonderful job with that Zoom coffee hour. We meet as a large group, and then she'll put us into breakout groups, and it's really fun to get to know people. It's been how I've gotten to know so many folks in the church, is through that. And Deb Curley and I had just a conversation in passing yesterday about what's the next step in terms of adult Sunday school. We taught a class together this fall, and I offered to help her to begin thinking about what comes next. So please, don't ever think that the church is closed, that St. Simon Peter is closed. It is not. The community continues. Worship will continue. Outreach will continue. Education will continue. All of those things will continue, just in a different way. In this time of reorientation, as all of us figure out how to be the church. And know that we're not alone in that. In the midst of everything that was happening for me on Friday, as I was thinking about Dr. Collins and what he said in that article, and thinking about what's going on with the rising numbers, COVID-related numbers, I got an email from Holy Spirit in Alabaster. I was their interim for 2 years, and I'm still on their list. And this past Friday, their rector sent out a video where they ceased in-person worship immediately. And then later in the day, my son, who's a member at All Saints in Homewood, sent a message from their interim rector, and they too are suspending services for the time being. I don't imagine that we three churches are the only ones that are making that difficult decision. I assure you that no clergy person wants to do that. It really is what we live for, Sunday morning. That's where we see most people and make those connections in worship and then in coffee hour. That's one of the things I've missed the most, and from my other experiences as interim in other places, is that coffee hour time where I get to actually meet people. Those social occasions, like a men's group. All those kinds of times where there's really that opportunity to get down deeper in those relationships. But that does continue. And it will continue. And I'm excited too for you about your new rector, who will be full-time. She's talented, she's experienced, and she is creative. And I know that Sarah Scott Wingo will continue to think about ways and help you discover ways to be the church in this time of pandemic, this time that just seems to have constant reorientation attached to it. That's why it's important for you to stay committed to things, to participate as best you can in whatever's offered via Zoom and other ways. To stay committed to that, and to stay committed financially. so that the financial resources are here so that Sarah Scott and the vestry and the other leadership folks of the church can carry out the mission and ministry of Christ Church through the St. Simon Peter in Pell City. I do want to mention one other group that has stepped out there and who's done really wonderful ministry in this time. That's Daughters of the King. When I raised the prospect of Daughters of the King contacting people in the parish, Faye immediately said yes. And the daughters immediately said yes and reached out to people in the parish. That's how we stay connected. That's how you stay connected in this time of reorientation. I want to bring it back to the gospel as I conclude. Thinking about what is being said both in Isaiah, in the collect of the day, and in the gospel, all of those carry with it, say in it, have the word prepare. You're preparing for something. And in this case, preparing for the arrival of the Christ child, for the arrival of Jesus Christ into people's lives. Not really knowing what that meant, how that was going to impact people. John the Baptist is saying, prepare, get ready. Something amazing is going to happen that's even more important than what I'm doing. But if you recall, John wasn't entirely prepared for what was coming because he had to send a messenger to say to Jesus, are you the one? Even though he was prepared for something new, he didn't know what it was. And what I think happens for people in preparing for the arrival of Christ that is both wonderful and disconcerting is that when Jesus Christ enters into our lives, it does indeed disorient us. Because Jesus Christ asks us to look at the world in a different way than the way in which we've been looking. To look at the world from his perspective. And that's not always our human perspective. It may be something as simple as how we feel about money. I have a good friend who was a churchgoer, and he said to me one time, he said, Bill, my primary motivation in life is how to make money. And he was good at it. He was a contractor, he owned real estate. He's still good at those things, but he went to a retreat, and it changed his life. Because although he had been a Christian all his life, there was something in that moment where Jesus Christ got hold of him and he reoriented his life after that moment of disorientation, and it was a fuller life. So Jesus Christ comes into our lives, and he is the one who disorients us. But what we discover is that reorientation that comes later is really the only way to be oriented in the world that makes any sense. Dr. Collins, who I mentioned earlier, I don't know a whole lot about him. I've just done a little research on him since I read about him, his piece from the NIH on Friday. And what I learned is this, is that up until graduate school, he considered himself an atheist. And then a patient, he was in the hospital, and a patient convinced him to start looking at Christianity. And then a Methodist minister put Mere Christianity, C.S. Lewis's book, into his hands. And Dr. Collins began being disoriented from this atheism and had himself reoriented toward Christianity, and it changed his life. From the little bit I've read about him, he is a man who is serious about his science. He really does believe in science, and he really does believe in Jesus Christ. And he has those two things in relationship with one another, and that is the way he is now oriented. But what came first was having his life turned upside down by Jesus Christ. Advent is a time of preparation, once again, for the arrival of the Christ child. It is a time in which we prepare our hearts and minds, prepare our lives to receive him in a new way yet again. But it's that preparation that doesn't have to be limited to Advent, because I think that because of how we human beings are, we need to be reminded again and again to reorient ourselves, or to be reoriented by Jesus Christ. A time like now, this time of disruption, this time in which we think we've got it figured out, what we're going to do, and something happens and we are yet again disoriented. What we can find in Jesus Christ is He is the one that no matter what comes our way, no matter what happens to us, no matter how bad the pandemic gets or anything else in our lives gets, that He is the one who reorients us to what is true and beautiful and good. He's done that from the beginning of time. He did it when He came into the world as that baby, and He continues to do it today. So in this time of disorientation, let's open our lives. Let's prepare ourselves to be reoriented once again by Jesus Christ, who comes into the world to accompany us on this journey and to orient us in the only way that's worth being oriented.